Good late morning, all, and welcome to Northern Vermont University's Spring 2021 Lecture Series. Our guest speaker today serves as the State of Vermont's Executive Director of Racial Equity. She was appointed to this position in June 2019 by Governor Phil Scott. In her role, she works with the state agencies to identify and address systematic racial disparities and support the state's efforts to expand and diversify Vermont's population. She relies on the data to inform this work and on the state's strategic plan to guide it. Prior to joining the state of Vermont, she served as the Director of Health and Housing Strategic Initiatives at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and as the Director of the Black, Latino, and Asian Caucus of the New York City Council. She holds a Juris Doctor with a concentration in international human rights and law from New York Law School, where she also directed the Civil Liberties Education Program for low-income and minority youth. She studied Anthropology and Philosophy at Fordham University, earning a Reverend J. Franklin Ewing S.J. Award for writing on the relationship between global human rights violations and the proliferation of HIV and AIDS. It is my honor to welcome Xusana Davis.
Buenos dias, everybody. So, dearly beloved, today we're here to talk about everybody's favorite topic, racism. Yeah, let's hear it for systemic discrimination. So, first of all, thank you all so much for the invitation. Thank you to the university and to all of you for being present, whether you're here in person or virtual. It's very meaningful to be here. I really enjoy academic spaces because I am a thinker and a scribbler at heart. And this is much, much more fun than a Zoom strategy meeting. So I'm happy to be here. I also like being around students and faculty because I think that you all are communities with so much power to get this done and to do it right. And I don't think that society leverages your power enough. And so let's talk about that power. Let's talk about everything that you have to offer and a little bit about the topic of systemic discrimination and what the state of Vermont is doing in this space and what we could be doing in this space. So I'm gonna talk for a few minutes, give you some numbers, some stats, some colorful charts. I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing at the state level. And then afterwards, what I'm really hoping we can do is dedicate most of our time together to just question and answer. I would really much rather hear from you and learn more from you and answer any questions you have. So let's get started. So this is one of the pivotal questions that I find myself asking a lot of people in this state. What's a Vermonter? What does it mean to be a real Vermonter? And depending on who you ask, you're gonna get different answers. In a lot of spaces, the concept of real Vermonter evokes symbols of environmental friendly, dog friendly, Subaru driving, middle-aged white people who wear Crocs and who really enjoy, I don't know, guitar things in a field. I don't know. When we think about Vermontiness, those are some of the images that we think about. But is that really who the state is? Is that really what the state is? I find it incumbent upon us to acknowledge that we gather here physically and virtually on land that remains unceded Abenaki territory. This land was neither bought nor given. And yet we consider the physical boundaries of this land Vermont. And when we think about who's from Vermont, we think of people who are probably not indigenous. What does it mean to be a native Vermonter? What does it mean to own not just the territory, but also the culture, the ownership of this space? Who's allowed to be here? Who gets watched closely and stared at based on your license plate or what you look like? This is Vermont, at least right now. What you're looking at is a population pyramid, and this is where we're going to get a little bit geeky. The sociologist in me can't help it, but this is a population pyramid which we use in demography to show the age and sex breakdown of a given society. So this population pyramid represents Vermont. The blue lines show the 2010 population numbers, and the purple lines show 2018 population numbers. And they're stratified by age, so the higher age brackets are at the top, and the lower age brackets are at the bottom. On the left, you see female population, and on the right, you see male population. So what does this show us? And I'm gonna get real fancy and use my pointer. So here at the very top levels, right, we've got 80 plus, a smaller population, much larger here in the sort of 45 to 75 age range. And then it dips back down again in 30s and 40s. We've got a bit of a bump out here in late teens and early 20s, and then a narrowing pyramid at the bottom in 0 to 5. What does that mean? The reason that these charts are so useful in demography is because they help us plan for the future by looking at who we have today. Now you see that kick out in about 15 to 24 ages. That's because Vermont draws a large college age population from out of state. So we've got more people in that age bracket who are here, often studying. But you notice that that shrinks right after they graduate. Why aren't students staying in Vermont? And there are lots of reasons for that. We also see that you've got a very large population of folks in the middle age brackets. We're talking 50s through 60s, even 70s. What that means is that our population is aging. We have a narrowing pyramid at the bottom, so we have fewer youth and more older folks. And that's fine. I mean, every society looks a little bit different, so that's not in and of itself a bad thing. However, when we look at future planning, are we going to have a large senior population who eventually tends to be non-working, not in the workforce anymore, and then a narrower working age population supporting the economy that's going to provide for that large non-working population? Sometimes you look at a population pyramid and you'll find that it shows a bulge in maybe the lower age ranges, youth, children, and a narrower working age population. And what that would tell you is when those kids move up into the next bracket, you've got to make sure that by then you've got enough jobs for them. Otherwise you'll have, civil unrest and such. So these are incredibly useful, and what this shows us is that we've got a large aging population, not so much of a young population, but this isn't the full story. This doesn't tell us a lot of things like who these people are, what they look like. For example, we know that Vermont is the second oldest state in the nation, second only to Maine, and it is also the second whitest state in the nation, second only to Maine. But those two data points themselves don't tell the full story, because when you break that down by racial group, what you find is that while the median age for white Vermonters and indigenous Vermonters is mid-40s and late 40s respectively, all other Vermonters of color have median ages in the 20s. And so what that tells us is that the younger populations in this state are the most ethnically diverse. We, as people of color in Vermont, tend to skew younger. As a matter of fact, I think that the rate of, I always have to phrase this really carefully. There are of the senior population in Vermont, there are fewer people of color as a share of seniors than there are people of color as a share of minors. In other words, if you happen upon a minor in Vermont, that person is more likely to be a person of color than a person who might be senior in Vermont is likely to be a person of color. So when we think about our future and our present, when I look out at you all and when I envision the number of you who are joining virtually, it's increasingly likely that more of you are going to look more like me. And so is Vermont in a place that fairly and accurately represents us in all of our dimension? Now, so much of this idea of Vermontiness hinges on communication and messaging. And that's not an accident. The narrative around what it means to be from or be in this state is based on years and years and years of message building, sometimes covert, sometimes very obvious. A few years ago, there was a young student who said, this state needs a new motto. It needs a motto. And of course, every respectable, centuries-old institution, their motto is in Latin, right? So let's make a Latin motto for Vermont. And it translated to, "May the 14th star shine bright," because of course Vermont was the 14th state. This is how Vermonters reacted. And I'll read these to you. Dorothy says, "It should say, 'Go back where you came from.'" Dan says, "The motto is on the language of the foreigners trying to take over the country should be Chinese since they are more than the Mexicans. Go back to Kenya, I don't speak atheist." Yeah, exactly. Brenda says, "I don't think so. I hate having to press 1 for English now." Sad. And my favorite, Gary says, "Hell no, this is America, not Latin America. When in Rome, do as the Romans do." Now, I don't know who's gonna be the one to tell Gary that the Romans spoke Latin, but I think that's more of a commentary on the public school system than anything else. The point is, whether you do not understand the difference between Latin and Latino, that's a side issue. The very point is, when people feel threatened in their nativism, when people think that their identities are subject to what they see as dilution, that is when real colors and real feelings come out. And so this notion of this tolerant, welcoming, groovy, chill place gets disrupted when we see the reality behind people's idea of what it means to represent or define Vermont, whether it's a logo or a mascot or a motto or a person. As a matter of fact, that messaging runs deep, deep enough that many of us internalize it. What you're looking at is a photo of the rear windshield of my neighbor's vehicle. Last spring, at the height of COVID-19, when there was lots of panic and suspicion, you might recall last year we had an incident in a town in southern Vermont where a mixed-race couple had been approached and harassed by people who told them things like, "Go back to New York, take your COVID with you," et cetera, et cetera. We internalized that. Everybody who's from out of state, everybody who hasn't been here for 19 generations, everybody who doesn't look like the quintessential Vermonter you think of in your mind, internalized that messaging so much so that my neighbors, who actually are young white people from a neighboring New England state, so they're probably like 97% Vermont, but my young white New Englander neighbors who happened to have an out-of-state license plate, though they had lived here for months before the pandemic, had to write into the dust on their rear windshield, "We live in VT, waiting on new plates." So it's not just about race and ethnicity. It's about the messaging around insider, outsider, flatlander, native, Vermonter that causes even white people in this state to feel insecure in themselves and in their safety, that they feel that they need to warn or put caveats on their property just to avoid vandalism and harassment. That is messaging. That is the power of messaging. Now, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer here, but let's give you more stats. Here in Vermont, the picture for different racial and ethnic groups needs a lot of work. We know that if you are Black American in this state, you're 6.1 times more likely to be arrested for misdemeanor possession of marijuana. We know that more indigenous Vermonters are being diagnosed with depression than white Vermonters are. And of course, that only includes those who have access to the healthcare to get those diagnoses. We know that the homeownership rate is very disparate, 72% for white Vermonters, 48% for Vermonters of color. We know that if Vermont had had wage equity, that is to say, if we had paid people the same money for the same work in 2015, our statewide economy would have been $0.42 billion with a B dollars higher. And I want to stay on that point for a moment because it's really important that we look at that as an example of the collective benefit of equity and the collective harm of inequity. A lot of times people say, well, racial equity, that's just for people of color, it's just for brown people, right? How does it help me? And it's like, all right, first of all, chill, it's not that serious. But also, when you do right by vulnerable people, when you do right by people who've been marginalized and oppressed, You're doing right by everybody, and this is a great example. Every single person in this state benefits from a better, larger, and more robust state economy. And all we had to do was pay people fairly for their work across racial groups. That's a benefit that you think goes only to those few people, but in reality, serves everyone. In Vermont, we know that the state also has a lot of work to do in terms of addressing inequities. In fiscal 2019, we had about 12% of our applicants for state jobs were of color, but only 6% of our hires. We also lost employees of color at a higher rate than white employees, and we paid them less on average than we paid white employees. We know that a lot of people, particularly Black Americans, don't go to places like national parks because they don't feel safe there. And of course, I hear some people who say, well, Vermont doesn't have any national parks. Okay. I go to a park and I don't really know if I'm in a town forest or a national park or a refuge. I just know I'm looking out for birds and otters. So call it what you like. The point is, if it's a large green space with no cell signal and, rangers about and, I don't see many people who look like me, then how likely am I to enjoy that space, whether you call it a national forest or not? We know that hate crimes are on the rise. In Vermont in 2018, 2/3 of them were based on racial and ethnic factors, and of course, as many of you know, that's just what gets reported. Now, I'm talking a lot about problems, and I don't like to complain very much, so let's talk about solutions. The problems and the issues that we've discussed so far are structural in nature, and so they require structural solutions, not individual ones. What do I mean by that? When you have a problem, I'll give you an example. If the lights went out in this building, if the lights went out across campus, maybe we didn't pay the bill or something. Imagine if administration sent everybody a memo saying, hey, starting effective immediately, you all have to walk around with headlamps and use your phones as flashlights, because it's dark. Sorry, I don't know what to tell you. That's an individual solution to a systemic problem. Expecting me to provide my own lighting to be in a classroom or to be anywhere on campus is not a solution to the lights being shut off, right? There are things that we can do to make that situation better so that people who may be visually impaired, people who only have 2 hands and can't carry a light and a bag and a water and whatever and a cell phone and a lollipop or whatever it is that you're carrying in your hands can actually function, right? So when we talk about systemic problems, things like housing insecurity, poverty, criminal justice, unlawful arrest and incarceration rates, educational disparities. When we talk about big structural problems, they need big structural solutions. It's not enough to tell a parent, well, if this school and all the schools around you are not suitable for your child, if everyone's racist, then just go to a private school or get a tutor. Well, that might work for the wealthy ones, but that doesn't work for everyone, and it doesn't fix the problems in the actual schools. That's what we mean when we talk about systemic solutions versus individual solutions, individual workarounds. These are some of the areas that the state has been working on to come up with those systemic solutions. Things like strategic planning. So we have sort of an overarching strategic plan. Think of it like a syllabus, but for the state. And it lays out everything that we want to accomplish, all the goals that we want to reach, and the timeline for when we want to reach those goals. So we've incorporated equity into that strategic planning because equity has to be foundational to your work. And so incorporating that into our strategic planning shows not only is it a priority for us, but that we're willing to put numbers to it and that we're willing to test ourselves with goals and timelines. Hiring and retention. I talked to you about some of the numbers, 12% of applicants, 6% of hires. So working on how are we posting jobs? Where are we posting jobs? For how long are we posting jobs? Are we including multilingual opportunities for people? Are the minimum requirements too onerous and too oppressive so that we're cutting out a lot of potential applicants? Once people get here, how are we retaining them? Because you can draw anybody to Vermont with a good job, but if everyone in their neighborhood flies Confederate flags, if the grocery stores don't have foods that are culturally relevant, if their students aren't getting the language assistance that they need in schools, how long can we really realistically keep them here? So, how are we working on our retention strategies? Are we bringing people in with entry-level jobs but never promoting them and always promoting their colleagues who are less qualified? These are some of the questions that we're asking. Language access. How many of us know Vermont's 10 most commonly spoken languages? I should put my hand, I always forget one, and it's usually a different one every time. But those languages include Burmese, Somali, Mai Mai, Lingala, Kirundi, Vietnamese. We have a large Chinese-speaking population. Of course, French, Arabic, Spanish, right? We have a lot of languages spoken in Vermont. I think Winooski High School has 41 languages spoken in that school alone. So how are we doing our outreach so that we're reaching people whose first language may not be English? Things like representation. It's easy to get a brown face and put them up in leadership and say, hey, we did it, we're not racist anymore, you got Obama, right? And that's not enough, that's not nearly enough. Representation means that people from all over the state, anyone who comes to the state, can see themselves reflected in the leadership, and that matters. It matters. I don't know if anyone has ever seen these things, but I look sometimes at, poor design, poor structural design. And I remember seeing this office building that they thought they were being cool, and they had these segments of their hallways that were just clear glass on the floor, so you could see the floor below you or above you. That tells me your design team did not have anybody who has ever worn a skirt. I still see doorways that are just narrow enough that I can barely squeeze through. That tells me you didn't consult anybody who has ever known anybody who uses a wheelchair, right? So representation matters because it saves us time, headache, embarrassment, disparity, and grief, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It's another thing that the state does. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's committees for everything. Everything. It's exhausting. And so these are some of the committees that are equity focused at the state level. Some of them were created. This chart goes back to about 1989. That's when the Human Rights Commission of the state was created. There's kind of a time warp here because, I only had enough room on the slide. But this brings us all the way over here, and you notice in the last couple of years, it's just been an explosion of equity groups left and right? And that's a good thing. Creating committees and task forces and commissions to look at these issues is so important. And yet, the looking at it and the talking about it is not the only work. It's the beginning of the work. And so I list these out to show how many of these entities exist, right? That's the talking and the thinking and some of the doing, but there's more doing that has to happen as well. I'm gonna close with this quote I really like. It's from Curtis Ogden. He's over at the Interaction Institute. And he says, "The work for racial equity is about undoing as much as it is about doing. We do not simply build new culture or behavior on top of old, especially in situations that are characterized by oppression. Some things must be released, and this letting go does not come easy." And I share this with you because so often when we think about equity work, we talk about what new things can we do? What new policies or whatever. Let's put up a banner somewhere. Let's fly a flag somewhere. Ooh, let's do a Black History lunch in the cafeteria with collard greens. Please don't do that, right? And that's great, and that's new stuff. But what we also have to do is look at what we've got existing on the books. Is it still serving us? Has it ever been serving us? Is it serving all of us? And if not, it's got to go. I'll give you an example. We often hear about emancipation and the end of slavery on paper in the United States, but many people don't know that we are still allowed, under the Constitution, to enslave people who are incarcerated. That's actually carved out in the 13th Amendment. So when we think about laws on the books and we talk about equity in the prison system and we say, yeah, now we're gonna let you make your calls home and not have to pay that much for it, or now we're gonna make sure that there's diversity in the curriculum for those of you who are incarcerated who are getting your GEDs or whatever. Yeah, that's great, but the Constitution says we can still enslave these people. Are we gonna talk about that, or are we just gonna do new cool stuff like Black History meals in the mess hall? So it's a combination of new good policy and the bravery and humility of undoing existing bad policy. And that's the balance. And so that brings me back to you all. You all are in a great position because you are in the halls of academia. It is your job to think. It is your job to make faces like, when you hear things that don't sound quite right. do that, but do it loud. I'm gonna let you in on a secret. Maybe your institution doesn't want me to tell you this, but nobody likes a lot of angry students because angry students are powerful and annoying. And you should be annoying. Be that. Because that's how change happens. So, again, I go back to those charts from the beginning of the presentation about the demographics and the median age for Vermonters, and you're it right now. You're it. So step into that power and own that and be that, but do so in a way that's informed. Know the history. Know what people have done and gone through before you came. Take that in stride and then move it forward. All right, I am very likely over time because I always go over time, so I'm gonna stop here. Again, I thank you so much for the invitation and for your time.
So I guess what we'll try to do is start off with questions from the audience, and then as that circulates, we'll focus on asking questions from the live stream as well. This one right there. If you can come up to the mic right here.
First, I just want to say thank you for coming in today and taking your time to speak with us. My question is, you mentioned that what it takes to bring students back. You spoke about retention, so what are ways we can educate people that don't look like us on ways that would keep us coming back? How would we help them better understand us more?
Excellent question. The question is, how do we educate people from dominant groups more about what it takes to retain us, specifically students of color who may be leaving Vermont? And that's a really interesting point because it intersects two things. One is age and the other is ethnic demographics, right? We already have a problem retaining residents of color in Vermont. People come, they stay a few years, they can't take it anymore because it's too racist or it's too this or it's too that, and then they leave. But then specifically with the student population, a lot of what we hear is, well, I left because there's better jobs elsewhere, or I left because I couldn't find housing, or I left because I could afford to buy a house in Kansas, not in Vermont. And so there's a real intersection here with the generation gap and with the racial and ethnic divide. And I think a lot of things have to happen with that. Number one, it's really important to educate that dominant group, folks in dominant groups, about the need for well-paying and meaningful jobs. And that's something that, we as a state have a large part to play in that, but also local business owners. Maybe you know people who own local businesses and say, hey, listen, if we want more young people to stay here and you want more diverse workforce, then you've got to be able to extend jobs to people who need them, right? So those of us who are graduating, maybe that means have an internship program or a fellowship program. Have a program where you help us to maybe cover some of our debt or our post-grad stuff in exchange for working for you for a few years, right? That's the kind of thing that helps people stay and put down roots and really settle in a place. Another thing that's important is that we do have a number of international students. How many opportunities are here outside of educational institutions that continue to support them in their learning, that continue to support them with immigration applications after their visas expire when they graduate, right? Do we have employers who are willing to sponsor people, maybe under the H-1B program or something like that? So those are some of the strategies. Again, I think so much of it hinges on looking at the state demographics and saying, our population's shrinking, we have the lowest birth rate in the country, and we're the second whitest state, even though we are a pocket surrounded by New York, Boston, Montreal, and Manchester. That's odd. And we've got to find out why. And those are some of the things that I hope might be useful.
Thank you.
Thank
I just
you.
have one more quick question.
Yeah.
I'm also hosting my own podcast. It's called On Second Thought, and I would just really love to learn more about you and connect with you more to see if I could actually possibly have you on the show.
If you'd like, I'd be happy to chat offline, and then we can talk more about that afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have another question. right there. I think it's Devin.
Don't judge, don't judge. First off, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to come here. And also, you talked about fixing systemic problems. And I just wanted to ask, you know, we're all local citizens, and that involves speaking to a government level who, let's be straight up, they don't care about things like that. They don't care about fixing the 13th Amendment, let alone rewriting it. They don't care about the fact that we're more likely to be arrested for petty possession of marijuana. So would you agree with me that it starts at the local government level and communicating with them?
So the question is that so much of what, please correct me if I'm paraphrasing it wrong. It sounds like the question is so much of what happens in terms of discrimination and bias happens at the local level, and you're asking if it's a correct assumption that it starts at the local level when you're talking about government action. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, like I'm asking, you know, to get the 13th Amendment rewritten, that's like a US government type level problem.
Sure.
Know? So would that equate to us putting pressure on our local government?
It's a matter of scale, really. I don't know if it necessarily starts or ends at the local level, but it's all a yes and, it's all simultaneous, right? So for example, a lot of discrimination and policy that is discriminatory in America was done at the local level. Think about policing, right? That's local. Education is very local. You know, those kinds of things. So much of it does absolutely happen at the local level. You are right about that. And then, you know, when we think about bigger things, federal level things, right? When we talk about state and federal level work, it's simultaneous. So people here in Vermont, yes, go to your select board meetings, go to the local policing commission meetings, talk to your sheriff who is elected at the county level. And then also be in contact with Senator Sanders' office, Senator Leahy's office, Congressmember Welch's office. I have interacted very closely with all of their offices. They're lovely people, and these are people who can bring your concerns to the table at the federal level, or who can at least direct you to more places where you can be heard. Another big thing is that when you talk about policy and you try to figure out what level to be involved at, for a lot of people that starts local, right? A lot of people say, hey, I had a kid and suddenly I cared about the schools, and then I joined the school board, and then they joined the select board, and then before you know it, they were running for a state seat, right? That's usually how that happens. And so at the local level, we have to be able to foster that kind of engagement, and that means new parents, new people who are joining the workforce, new generation of young professionals who are like, hey, I want to get involved. And no disrespect to anybody who's been on their select board for 45 years, but you have to be able to pass that baton, you know? So I would completely agree, local level involvement is so key, but it should be done simultaneously with state and federal level, and non-governmental action as well. There's a lot that happens outside the government sphere that influences the government sphere. And I know this is tacky, but you know, there's, they passed some bill like LGBTQIA plus rights in the UK, and when they wrote that bill, they were actually quoting a Twitter cat in the bill, like a cat with a Twitter account who talks a lot about trans rights. And that ended up in a piece of real legislation that affected people. So there's so many ways that you can impact policy of government, even outside of government.
Thank you.
We have two questions from the live stream. The first one is, how can we talk to educators about racial inequities without them getting defensive?
And I guess the first question I have in response to that question is, what level of educators? Right? If we're talking about K through 12, it's a different story than higher ed. And the reason I say that is because there's a lot more latitude when it comes to things like curriculum or school policy at this level, right? At the higher ed level. When it comes to K-12, we often have a group of stressed out and overworked and often underpaid instructors who are teaching to a set of standards. You know, I come from New York State, we have a regents exam, and so many of our teachers just teach to the regents. and the curriculum is so narrow, and a student might say, hey, can we talk about the incarceration clause of the 13th Amendment? No, we don't have time for that, because they've got to keep up with a very rigid mandate. And so I think when it comes to talking to educators about equity, first of all, it does matter what level of education we're talking about. And second, there are ways to approach the conversation, right? For example, there's a difference between having a conversation with a professor who maybe exhibits discriminatory behavior or coded language or microaggressions in the classroom versus having a conversation with a professor or an administrator because you want to start a campus club or have a particular event or a safe space or whatever, versus having a conversation with administration about saying, hey, we need more policies about equity on campus, versus having a conversation with the Board of Trustees about increasing the scholarship fund for merit-based scholarships for disadvantaged students or something like that, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can approach conversations with educators and people in education administration. But I think the way to do it so that they're not so defensive, one way to do it is to demonstrate to them how it benefits the institution, right? I mean, again, back to the 0.42 billion larger economy, this is something that benefits everybody, and all you got to do is stop underpaying this group of people. So one is showing how there's a bigger institutional benefit to whatever it is you're proposing. The second way is to also keep in mind what efforts they have done. Maybe they've taken steps A, B, and C, and you want them to get to E, F, G. Acknowledge A, B, and C too, right? Because it's not always easy to be in those positions, and sometimes from where we're standing, it's not enough, it's never enough. And sometimes from their perspective, they may not have the imagination to know that they could go further. And then another really key piece is understand their limitations as well. I've often heard from people who say, I want to do these measures, but legally I can't. Or there's a rule that says I'm not allowed to. Or the way that, the way our bank account is set up, we can't do X, Y, Z. And so having a conversation with them that says, hey, this is an ultimate goal. This is how we envision getting to that goal. What do you see as a challenge or a limitation? Because then that puts it on them not to just shoot you down and say, no, that's not going to work, but rather to say, how can we get it to work, right? Anchor the goal as the given. And then, of course, there's all kinds of interpersonal stuff about, conflict management and stuff, and that's another whole conversation, but yeah, those are just some of the strategies, I think, that you can approach that.
So the clarification was, I think you touched base on it. It was actually focused on post-secondary education and professors.
Oh, then that's easy, because then all you have to do is say, we're going to stop paying our tuition if you don't do it. I'm sorry, NVU, please don't ban me from coming back here. But no, I'm saying that halfway in jest, but halfway not. But the point is, you have a lot more power, I think, and voice at the higher ed level than you think. Because at this point, you're well-oiled, functioning adult machines who can actually really think through things and create good policy, and you also, they rely on your money. I mean, I hate to say it, but yeah, to some extent, you help to support the organization, and so exercising a say in it is key.
The next question is, and I think this is focused on professors as well, a little similar to the last question, but I would like to ask how to talk to educators about racial inequities in their classrooms and class materials. They always become defensive and dismissive and shut down the question.
Yeah, that's a forever question, and that happens, that doesn't just happen in Vermont or in majority white places, that happens pretty much everywhere. I see screenshots all the time on the web of emails that people get back from their professors that are super defensive. And there's a couple of things with that. One, there's a difference between having this conversation in person, like in office hours or something, versus on email, because at that point everything's documented. And sometimes people shut down or they say the official line because it's documented on paper. Now, I'm not telling you that you should not have a paper trail of anything. I'm not saying you want to get everything memorialized on paper. I'm just saying that there's a different dynamic when something is face-to-face versus, typed out. And you may find that a response could be different depending on different circumstances. Use your judgment if the person is approachable versus if the person is not. That's number one. Number two, you may find it useful to bring somebody along who has made the same observations in that classroom, or somebody who can attest to that and say, yeah, actually the whole, and I'm making this up here, don't take this as an NVU thing, but yeah, the whole economics department or the whole sociology department has this sort of culture in it, or whatever. And again, I don't know anything about NVU's econ or anthro departments, so that's just completely hypothetical, but I'm just saying. So yeah, you may bring along another student or another person on staff who has noticed the same patterns, and then that way it's a little bit easier to have the conversation. Another way to do it is come with solutions sometimes. I find that really easy. Hey, I've noticed this thing that tends to happen. Like, for example, you let male students go on and on and on for 20 minutes at a time when they raise their hand, and you cut female students off every 30 seconds and interrupt them constantly, or something like that, right? You might come making that observation, and then you might come with a solution, like, I might suggest maybe that we have an informal policy about speaking time, maybe give every student 2 minutes or something like that, just to make it fair, right? And then that way, and some folks are gonna interpret that as, don't tell me how to do my job, but it is helpful when you have a solution, because then at that point, you're not, complaining about problems without proposing solutions is whining. Right, is the saying. I'm not saying I believe that every circumstance, but in some circumstances it can be useful to say, hey, I'm noticing an issue, but don't worry, I've got your back because here are some thoughts about how we could fix it. And I think it's also helpful sometimes when people get called out on that sort of behavior, if it's very public, they feel more defensive, they feel embarrassed, they feel like, oh no, I can smell a lawsuit coming. But sometimes people find it easier if you take them aside. They may not know that they're doing it. They may be mortified to find out that they're doing something that's considered offensive. So take all of that into account, that sometimes it's just a little easier to tell people something offline. And if you find that that's not working, then you shouldn't be afraid to escalate something if you feel like it's creating a hostile or unsafe environment for you or others. Yeah.
Perfect. We have 2 more questions, but I think there was a student who had a question as well from the audience. Yes, you can come up.
I think you can tilt it down.
Thank you, and it's like a big topic. So basically I wanted to go back on the education topic. I'm a military kid, and so I've been around like a bunch of schools, like just bouncing around different places. So I lived in Europe half my life, and it's pretty diverse, and we learn a lot about different parts of history. But every single time I was brought to an American school in the United States, we barely touched on the topic about Black culture or African American history, or even like the bad stuff like slavery. It was like something small that no one really brought up because they didn't want to bring up, but we would talk about white history and the great people, our great presidents who weren't really so great. Mm-hmm. So how do you feel like we can improve like school systems, especially in middle school and high school, where we're taught not to disobey our teachers and listen to what they have to say because they're always right?
Yeah, excellent question. The question was, American curricula, especially around history and social studies, tend to be really, really inadequate when it comes to things like accurate historical representations, which historical figures we're lifting up and celebrating and acknowledging, and how do we do better on that, right? Mm-hmm. And so I would say, there are many things we could do, but the 2 that I suppose I want to say is, number 1, you got to supplement. You got to supplement on your own. And again, I know what you're thinking, but that's an individual solution, and you said we need structural solution, and that's true. That's true. But I think that for the time being, we've got to be able to protect ourselves and our young people by saying, okay, you know what, whatever you're learning in school, we're just going to supplement that. You're going to read Howard Zinn, right? Or you're going to read the, oh my gosh, why can't I remember her name? Anyway, you're going to read things like A People's History, or you're going to read other folks who are willing to give that more expansive view, right? So while we're making the systemic solution, we're also going to have the individual solution of being able to do our own learning and do our own research and not just trust everything that the government tells us, because no offense, government, but you lie. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is, and this tracks really closely with the conversation in Vermont, right, around xenophobia, insider, outsider, real Vermonter, is that people don't like hearing bad things about places they love or people they love, right? It's hard. Imagine if somebody was over here talking smack about your best friend or your sibling or your parents. You might feel a type of way about that, right? It's difficult to hear negative things about places we love. And so a lot of times people don't want to hear or teach or think about those uglier parts of American history because they label it as unpatriotic, or they label it as un-American or negative, or you're painting Washington in a bad light. The myth that Washington had wooden teeth, that's not true. He did have a lot of false teeth though, and they were made from the pulled teeth of the people he enslaved, right? When we think about the founders, every founder, every person from the 18th century was like a doctor and an inventor and a philanthropist and a lawyer and a whatever and, a shoe shiner and did a really good manicure or something like that, right? And it's like, how could you do all those things? And the reason you had time to do all those things is because you had people working land for you, making your money. You didn't have to work. You could be a lawyer for fun. You could be a doctor for fun. You could tie a key on a kite for fun, because you had free labor, right? And so when we think about these historical figures, it is hard for a lot of people who love America to accept the negative parts of her and of these people. And so to some extent, we have to approach this conversation with the understanding that it's an uphill battle. However, that's the thing about truth. You can suppress it for as long as you like, but it's coming out. And I think we're already seeing that with things like the 1619 Project, et cetera. At the federal level, under the previous administration, they did a lot to try to suppress that education, right? They came out with the 1776 Project or whatever, which was 1776 Commission, which was just ridiculous. But the point is, part of it means supplementing your own learning as an individual, and part of it means us being able to responsibly change our curricula. And again, remember what I said earlier, so much of people's first entry into local service is like, I'm on the school board or something like that, or I'm on a committee that's reviewing the curriculum standards in schools. It doesn't seem like it's a big deal, it seems boring, but this is really where all these conversations are happening. And these are some of the ways you can affect that change, because education is hyper-local. And then, Texas, Texas is wild because they buy all of their state textbooks as one big bulk purchase. All their schools use the same books. And so the publishing companies for educational books cater to what they want because that's the biggest market. So all the other smaller school districts around the country get textbooks that are basically reflective of what Texas wants. And just so you know, as recently as like 2010, they were still teaching that the Civil War was the war of northern aggression. So that's kind of what we're up against. I'll leave it there, but yeah, it's a combination of that individual pursuit and keep chipping away at the lies.
Okay, can I have one more question?
Go ahead.
Okay, so basically I have one more question. So basically I lived in Virginia, and I lived in the part where slavery first started. And so for me, it was like really hard to go around because all of the people around me were of white descent, and they spoke of slavery like it was nothing. And literally maybe 2 miles away from my house was the first slave post, where slaves were like beaten and sold. And there was a Ulysses S. Grant statue maybe 3 miles away from that. And instead of, they decided to vandalize the post, and yes, I get something bad, but it's also a part of history. But when they took down the Ulysses S. Grant statue, they made a big predicament and a big deal about everything, but they didn't make a big deal about that. So how do you feel culturally when we see stuff about different cultures, and especially stuff about Black history? Like, how do you feel when people decide to vandalize that instead of vandalizing something or taking down something, protesting peacefully to get something taken down of someone or something that actually was harmful to one's community?
Yeah, so the question is, how does it feel, or what is it like when you have people who are outwardly hostile to commemorations and observances having to do with things like Black history or multiculturalism, but who put up such a big fight when we look to retire similar markers that celebrate racist people or ideas? And I think it really just goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is people don't like hearing negative things about things they like. And so you're going to be defensive of your Ulysses S. Grant statute or your General Robert E. Lee statute, not because either one of them was really worth a damn, but because you feel like a part of you is being erased. And these are people who see life as zero sum. They see it as if you're getting ahead, then that means necessarily I'm falling behind. And so when you erase something that they think is a part of who they are or part of their culture, it feels as if you're erasing them to them, right? And so that is a mentality that sometimes can be cajoled into the light and can be brought to truth. And sometimes we just leave it behind because we don't need that mentality. And some folks are not to be convinced. And the art is knowing the difference, right? Who can be brought along and who's kind of a lost cause. And I hate to sound so pessimistic about it, but that's one of the realities, right? That we see in politics, we see it in family structure. How many times have you had a family member who fundamentally disagreed with your lifestyle choice or whatever? And then they came around 17 years later or whatever, but they came around. I don't know that I have an answer for that. I mean, my family's from Latin America, and I'm first generation here, so I don't have roots in America, and so I've never felt like American history was my history. And so to some extent, I don't really see myself anywhere in any of these statues or whatever. So perhaps I can't speak from direct experience about what that feels like, but I would imagine that past is important, and that acknowledgement of that past is important, and also what we're building in the now is equally important. And we could also spend a lot of time dedicating ourselves to the future we want to build. Also, I'm so sorry, one more thing. I think, what was it? Was it Chile? Or maybe Russia. I think in Chile they did it, where they just took statues of people they don't like anymore, who actually were horrible people, and they didn't get rid of them, but they just smushed them. And they left them out, but they were just like, we're not gonna get rid of it because it's a part of history, but we'll smush it, and then that's how you know how we really feel about it. And so they kind of half melted it, and it's just really contorted guy who's just, it's bizarre, but it's hilarious. And you know, that's an option. It's an in-between option.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have one more from the audience, and then we'll go back to the live stream. I think Jason was first, and then once we go to the live stream, I'll go back to Kelly.
Hello. I just want to say thank you for being here, too. One of the things is, as future educators in the school system, when I worked in schools, one of the big problems is parents. And it's a huge deal to this generation. And one of the things that they disagree on is, when we teach slavery in schools, they don't want to hear it in schools because it's not part of their own cultures. And one of the things is, I feel, is the district or administration doesn't really have the teachers' backs in that situation, trying to teach stuff that is a big part of history that we should be learning, like slavery and so on. What can we do as educators to try to get the administration to back us up in this situation? Because I feel like administration's just too scared to take their teachers' side because they don't want to deal with lawsuits and stuff like that. They just want parents to be happy, but do you think that's the way to go? Like, what can we do to protect history and to make it go better? So.
Yeah. Great question. The question was, for those who are current or aspiring educators, how do we promote the fair teaching of history and social studies and related topics in the face of angry parents or unsupportive administrators? Is that about right?
Yes.
So, yeah, one of the things I would say is it is absolutely critical for administration to have teachers' backs in that way. And one of the things that teachers can do, first of all, is show unity on that front. So it's often easier, I think, to make the case when you've got a number of teachers. Maybe it's the whole history department, or maybe it's, history plus English department who say, hey, we've come up with a curriculum. We're going to read a book in the English classes that ties into this lesson in the history classes, so it's sort of a universal curriculum. Lay it all out and say, this is our plan. It's going to be, over the course of 6 weeks or what have you. These are the topics we're going to teach. These are the topics we're not going to teach. These are the activities that we're going to be doing. They're vetted. They're considered evidence-based. They're used in these many jurisdictions, blah, blah, blah. That's one way, because I think a lot of times administrators and parents feel more at ease when they know what's coming. And so I think the more that you can lay out the curriculum, I think the easier it is for folks to be amenable to it. The other thing I would say is that I think Utah allowed its parents to opt their children out of Black History Month education. And so to some extent, a lot of it happens at the state level usually, but in Vermont we have local control, and so it is often the case that the state education department can't mandate schools to do or not do something. We can put a lot of standards and models out there, but it often happens at the district level. And so another thing that I would say is if you're in Vermont specifically, develop a relationship with like the Principals Association, the Superintendents Association, and the local school boards. And say, hey, listen, we're doing this in these 3 school districts, or we're doing it in these 12 towns. It's worked really well. Your town should be adopting it. Or just kind of help them understand, maybe do a sample lesson with them, walk them through it. There are some folks who are just gonna say no always because they don't wanna hear bad things about history. And there are some folks who are gonna say, yeah, sure, but they're gonna use really messed up curricula. I mean, there's one school in Southern Vermont that's using a worksheet that has students role play being an illegal alien who's about to be deported. And it's just the most bizarre thing. And then there's another one that is about terrorism, and it just has heavy Islamophobia vibes in it, and it's just terrible. And that's being used currently in Vermont. So sometimes these things are being taught extremely poorly, and being able to draw that distinction for parents and administrators is really key. And again, as much as possible, if we're using curricula that are existing and evidence-based and highly regarded in a wide number of places, I think that helps to make the case. And at the end of the day, so much of this pressure has to come from the students and the parents themselves. It means a lot, I think, when you've got a handful of angry parents saying, wah, 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 we don't want to hear about Columbus, versus 2 handfuls of parents saying, no, we need to hear about Columbus, right? And that helps the administrators, and it helps those teachers to make the case, because then it's not just them on their own, but rather it's the community itself saying this is important.
Thank you.
Now back to the live stream. Is there a state or municipality that provides a good example of how to implement some of Xusana's equity recommendations?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the recommendations that have been made either in my reports or in the task force's reports or the advisory panel's reports or any of the number of reports that come out of those other committees that we listed earlier, a lot of them are recommendations because they exist in other jurisdictions that have successfully implemented them. So the answer is yes. There are lots of local, state, and federal, some policies that have served as positive examples for how we can do some of this work. The trick is, and there's a bunch of tricks, but one of them is that in a state like Vermont, we have a smaller budget than a lot of other jurisdictions. So I used to work for City of New York. City of New York has a budget that is about $97 billion. And then I came to Vermont, and our budget is like $6 billion for the whole state. And so that makes it hard. It makes it hard to dream big sometimes because we can't pay big necessarily. However, I say that with a huge asterisk because budget and funding and limitations and scarcity is one of the first barriers that they will put up in front of you and say, ooh, sorry, it's a great idea, but we just can't afford it. And when you say that, what you're saying is, justice is nice, but it's expensive, so can we find a cheaper way to get there? And the answer is no. There's no cheap way to get to justice, right? Because if you were willing to manipulate an economic system for hundreds of years in your favor, then you should be willing to undo that economic manipulation in favor of justice in a way that boosts everybody. So I say that as kind of a twofold thing. One is I roll my eyes every time they say we can't afford it, but also it is a reality that in our state, we can't afford everything. And so the trick is, again, going back to strategic planning, timing it out. What is a right now thing? What is a down the line thing? And what is a thing that if we get everything else right, we might not even have to do it because we will have fixed that problem by the time we get there, right? So those are all some of the considerations. But yeah, there's a lot of places doing great work. I think about King County, Washington, which is named after a guy. It's where Seattle is, and it's named after a guy whose last name is King, who was really horrible, but then they renamed it for Martin King, so they didn't have to change any of the signs or whatever. King County, Washington does great work. Portland, Oregon does phenomenal work on equity. I think City of Austin, actually, Austin, Texas, who just reduced police funding and took that money and reinvested it to buy some abandoned hotels and house people, which is exactly what the defund movement was all about. So they're doing that in real time. San Antonio is another really good one. So if anybody's interested in looking at policy from other jurisdictions, those are some other ones that are doing some great work.
So this leads right into the next question. Is there any county in Vermont that has accomplished providing more equity that could be used as an example of success for other counties in Vermont? So you mentioned some of the areas that's out of state, but any in-state counties that...
Yeah, that's a trap, and I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna answer that because I think a lot of people would expect me to say Chittenden, and it's true. Chittenden has done a lot, but they're not the only place. And I think that it's really important to lift up the work that's happening, especially in southern Vermont. Places like Putney and Brattleboro, places like even up in the Kingdom, there's a lot of work that's being done in the Kingdom that's moving towards equity, particularly for the refugee population. We've got, of course, there's always stuff happening in central Vermont, but you know, when you take out Chittenden in central Vermont, I think a lot of people often feel forgotten. And it's important that they not feel forgotten because so much of this work has to happen in those other places. And we need people to recognize that it doesn't matter if you're in the town of Victory that has a population of 87, it still matters that you're doing this. So are there counties in Vermont that are doing this work? Well, yes, absolutely. Windham County and Chittenden County and lots of other counties. But I think more importantly is how many pockets of communities do we have around the state doing this work? Because that's where you're really seeing that grassroots and that force for change is in the communities.
Perfect. And I said 2 questions and then back to the audience. So we have one more question via live stream, but I'll go back to the audience to ask the question, and then we'll go. Okay. So for our live stream, do you have any suggestions on how we can support our students of color mental health on campus? Are there some resources that can be offered that the students can take advantage of on and off campus?
Hell yeah, I've got tons of solutions. For starters, listen to people. Listen to people when they tell you, hey, there's a problem, or hey, I'm experiencing bias or discrimination. Don't try to explain it away or justify it. Don't do that, what were you wearing, thing. Or don't do that, well, don't victim blame, right? So yeah, number one is listen to people. And that actually has a number of prerequisites to it, because in order to listen to people, people have to be able to come to you. You have to be approachable. You have to create a space and an environment that's conducive to people coming to you with concerns or complaints. So it's not just about you being able to listen to them when they come to you, but about creating an environment where they want to and feel that they can trust to come to you, right? The second thing I would say is don't just wait for people to come to you with a problem. Be proactive. Reach out to students. Reach out to some of the campus groups maybe and say, hey, we're just checking in. We want to make sure that everything is good, that folks feel like they're being treated well here, that folks feel like they're safe here, et cetera. Is there anything that we could do around campus climate that might be useful? So one is be approachable, and then 2 is be proactive and approach the student body. The next thing I would say is there's so many wonderful lessons that we can take from the UVM staff. Wanda Heading Grant, who is their, I think they call her the diversity guru up there, and she is absolutely phenomenal. She and her team have done so much in the way of equity on campus at UVM. So I would encourage the institution and administration here to have those conversations and to learn from some of those examples. Another thing that's really important is to recognize that as we're shifting to hybrid models of learning and we've gone to a very virtual world, that does create some disparities, particularly with the tech divide, right? Not everybody lives in an area that has high-speed connectivity. Not everybody lives in a home environment that's really conducive to that. If you've got 4 other siblings with you and everybody's on the internet at the same time, it makes it hard to learn. So making sure that we're creating a learning environment that's actually serving students, all students, not just the ones we assume have all the tools and resources necessary to shift in this sort of unpredictable time, is really important. The next thing I would say is, do you have a lot of students who may be having trouble adjusting? Maybe they're not from the country or from the state. And if that's the case, then not only do you have the layer of race and ethnicity, but on top of it, maybe the layer of language access or immigration. So seek those students as well who may not know that they have a path to come and to talk to you about it. If there isn't a campus club, maybe make one. Create an environment where people want to be. And then in terms of supporting students' mental health specifically, you know, again, when it comes to resolution of problems, so often we think about discipline. We think about punishment, we think about police, we think about, well, let's just put more officers around, let's just have more patrols, let's just have more of that. And that is almost the exact opposite, I think, of what young people of color want, is more eyes in uniforms with badges watching us all the time, right? So reconsider what it means to respond to a complaint. Reconsider what it means to address a problem. If you see a brown person sleeping in a common area, why would you assume that she's a trespasser and not a student, like that incident in Yale a couple of years ago, right? So yeah, stop approaching brown kids on campus and asking for ID. That's just unnecessary. There's lots of things we could do to support people's mental health, and so much of it is just about not deteriorating people's mental health, you know?
Thank you. Well, I guess we'll go with one more student after that, and then we'll wrap up.
Something that stood out to me from your presentation was like the talk about xenophobia in Vermont. And like, I'm somebody who grew up in Vermont, and it's something I've never really thought about before, like that connection between xenophobia in Vermont and racism. You know, because it's like such a ingrained part. It's like something you're almost like proud of. You know, you see somebody with like a Massachusetts plate, and you're like, oh, there's a Flatlander. Like, they shouldn't be here. It's like automatic. So I'm wondering, like, with something that's like that automatic and ingrained in our culture in Vermont, it's like, how do we begin to address that, like on an individual level and like on a structural statewide level?
Yeah, excellent question. The question was on the topic of xenophobia or sort of nativism, insider, outsider, in Vermont, how do we begin to address that on a structural level and an individual level so that we don't have those automatic reflexes when we see people who we think might be from out of state? And so the answer to that, well, there are a few answers to that, and I think one of them is we humble ourselves and recognize our dependence on people from out of state and from out of the country. Some of our school districts would not still exist were it not for, I'm so sorry, there's a phone ringing and it's mine because I forgot to silence it, so it's over there and I can't do anything about it. So there are a couple of our school districts that may not exist today were it not for an influx of students of color in Vermont. And so when we look at local communities who are like, there's too many brown kids in our school, that's not what our population looks like. Okay, well, you wouldn't have a school if it weren't for the brown kids, so, right? Or tourism. Recently, you may have seen in the news that there was a town that put out its annual finance report or something like that, and they had a cover page that basically said things like, what did it say? It said, stop trying, if you come from over there to over here, stop trying to make over here like over there. We like it over here, and we don't want it to be like over there, so you're free to leave and go back there at your earliest convenience. That was the front page of a formal official document in a municipality in Vermont 2 weeks ago. So when we think about, and the kicker is that this is a town that relies so heavily on tourism dollars. You wouldn't exist if it weren't for people from over there, right? So I think step one is we have to acknowledge that it's really easy, I think, to speak down to or to think less of people who are not from here, but we would completely disappear if it were not for people who are not from here. And so we rely on that, and we have to act like that, right? There's a certain ingratitude that comes, I think, with that mentality. The second thing is that so much of Vermont is made up of people who are from somewhere else, and they've just been here long enough that they can play it off. I know people who I assume are Vermonters, and they're like, no, I got here 4 years ago. I'm from Jersey. But, you know, you look like a typical Vermonter, and so people kind of pass. I think that at the individual level, it really is just about recognizing what are all of the things around me that may not be here if it weren't for folks coming in, right? I wouldn't have this great Thai restaurant. I wouldn't have this great cultural thing that we do every summer. I wouldn't have this beautiful mural that was painted by a refugee here if it wasn't for those things. And recognize that, and recognize that the state cannot remain static as it was, right? The population who was here in the 50s, many are still here, but they're not gonna be here forever. And if we wanna keep things as they permanently were, we're gonna get what we've always gotten. And if we want to join the rest of the nation and the rest of the world in advancing, then we have to let go of some of that rancorous, this toxic xenophobia, where we create an environment where we push people away. Because I'm gonna be honest, and I say this sometimes, and I always have to give this caveat, it's gonna sound really harsh, but it's true. Vermont needs outsiders more than outsiders need Vermont, and that's just a fact. If I want to go skiing, I can go anywhere. I can go to Colorado. I can go to New Hampshire. I can go back to New York if I want to go skiing, right? If I want to be surrounded by snow and white people and stores that close at 8 o'clock, there's lots of places to go for that. What's going to make me want to come to Vermont? Is it the people who look me up and down at the gas station because I've got an out-of-state plate who make me feel unsafe? Because if that's the case, I don't have to spend money here or pay property tax here or enroll a child in school here or, you know, be a tourist here, and that's a shame for everybody. And so I think it really boils down to a certain humility that comes with saying, we like who we are, but we can't survive without each other. And we're proud to be Vermonters, but that doesn't mean that you have to put down other people, right? And I think that's similar to, folks, I'm very proud to be from the heritage that I am, right? But that doesn't mean that I think less of Black people or Asian people or white people or indigenous people, right? I'm who I am, and that's fine. And I'm proud of that, but that doesn't mean that I look at people who are not Latino and I go, you probably eat a lot of mayonnaise, right? I don't, there's no need for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Xusana. I know Northern Vermont University is excited to have you presenting to us today, and then we're honored to have you. I know it's a lot of information that you provided that we can take back and use for our institution as well. So thank you all for coming, and thank you all on the live stream as well for having Xusana Davis today. Thank you.